Hello, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to Lecture 15, Ring of Gyges, where we take a look at a small, famous portion of Plato's Republic, specifically a small excerpt from Book 2. So when I say Book 2, I mean Chapter 2. These ancient texts, philosophical texts, are oftentimes differentiated in terms of books. So Book 1, so the Republic has 10 books, but that's just what we mean by chapters. So the Ring of Gyges is a famous part of the beginning of Book 2 or Chapter 2 of the Republic. So we'll take a look at what these characters, Socrates and Pals, have to say about morality. We'll have two parts in this lecture. So in the first part, in this video, we'll introduce Socrates and Plato, a couple obviously very famous figures in the history of philosophy, and we'll discuss them, introduce who they are. So Socrates, your penultimate philosophical figure, so more on him in a moment. We'll introduce and talk about, the Republic a little bit more and what's going on in Book 1. So what precedes the excerpt then that we had, what takes place there, what's important there, and then can we, because that kind of sets the stage then for the excerpt that we have. We'll talk a little bit about Thrasymachus' challenge, which is issued by Thrasymachus at the end of Book 1 or Chapter 1. We'll talk about that. And then we'll really talk about then the focus of not only the Ring of Gyges or not only Book 2 or Chapter 2, but really, I would argue, 9/10 of the entire dialogue, right, of the Republic. And that's, in what sense is it useful? In what sense is it good? Justice, doing the right thing, being moral. In what sense is that good? And so at the end of this first part, we will then see what Glaucon has to say. So he's going to take up Glaucon and Thrasymachus. They sort of present what Glaucon calls the normal or average everyday view of morality. So in other words, what he thinks most people believe in terms of morality. And by the way, as we're going to see, this is a very Hobbesian picture. And so he's going to present this view of morality. And so that's then going to be presented and juxtaposed with what Socrates is going to suggest. Okay, so we're going to focus in then on the Ring of Gyges, which is this famous legend which Glaucon's bringing up to support his position about morality, this normal, average, everyday viewpoint, at least according to him, of morality, and support that. And then we'll get his comparison of the perfectly just with the perfectly unjust, again, in an attempt to support his notion that when we view justice or doing the right thing, when we view that as good or desirable, it's only in this sort of indirect sense. It's not good in and of itself. Okay, and so then the part 2 video, the second half of the lecture, we'll really dive into Socrates / Plato's philosophy in general, to then get an idea of what Socrates' response is going to be. His defense then of why justice or doing the right thing or morality is not only good for its consequences, right? If we appear just, it's not only good if we appear just, but it's actually good in and of itself. So we'll see then in defending that viewpoint, we'll talk about his very famous, unique view of evil, this idea that all evil, anytime a wrong occurs, it's a reflection of ignorance on the part of the wrongdoer. And of course, this has all kinds of implications then. If it was ignorance on their part, if they didn't know any better, then should we be punishing them? Or should we be instead maybe emphasizing teaching and enlightening them? So this, again, very famous, unique view, that controversial view, that all evil is ignorance, right? Whenever something wrong is done, it's, again, a reflection of a lack of knowledge on the part of the person that did the evil, and in some sense, then they didn't truly intend to do it, right? They were ignorant in doing it. And we'll see why that he thinks that's the case. We'll offer a couple of arguments for that position, which I call the external and internal arguments. And so we'll, again, ultimately see in sort of describing evil in that sort of way, then Socrates' ultimate answer. Well, just because most people seem to prefer doing evil when they can, that doesn't mean that that's actually in their best interest. And so you can't rely, spoiler alert, you can't rely on what people actually in fact do, because they oftentimes act ignorantly. So even though they have this opportunity with the ring to get away with stuff and do stuff, that doesn't mean that injustice, because they then start doing it, is truly good for them or desirable, but rather they just don't know any better. And so Socrates is going to maintain that justice, despite the appearances and despite the overt actions of people, is not only good for its consequences and for appearing just, right, but also good in and of itself. So again, that'll be the part two lecture, or the part two video of lecture 15, where we'll then go in and really flesh out Socrates' defense of his position. But let's go ahead then and go back to Socrates and Plato and discuss them, who these figures are. Obviously, very important figures in the history of philosophy. You know, you might say the most important. I think I mentioned in lecture 1, if you were to poll the average Joe Blow out on the streets and say, name a philosopher, they're probably going to say Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle. And there's a good reason for that. So these guys are very, very important figures. I went out and, again, got some props for us here. I was shocked, actually. It's been a while since I've been out to this portion of the library, and I'd always thought I had a ton of Aristotle books, but Plato, I actually have more Plato books than I do Aristotle. Actually, it was like a whole shelf and then some. So another very prolific writer. He actually wrote, so this is The Republic, arguably the most famous, significant book in the history of philosophy. Plato wrote 43 dialogues, although some of those are disputed. I want to say, and it's been a while since I kind of looked into this and really studied Plato, but I want to say 29 of those are undisputed. In other words, all the scholars, the Plato scholars, are on board with, hey, these were all written by Plato, undeniably. And then there's a whole, 14 others, which some say were probably written by Plato, and some argue probably not. So regardless, right, that's a lot, especially if you consider, some of them are several hundred pages long. In fact, I have another one that's pretty long, the Laws. I believe this is the last one he wrote. Another long one. So again, very prolific writer, clearly. And what really stands out about his writing as well is that they're all in dialogue form. So we talked about that, right? Obviously very different. And so you kind of got a feel for that just from our little excerpt, how different it is reading, say, Plato versus the traditional philosophy that we've been used to. And I always say that's both good and bad. It's good in the sense that it's easier for rookies, I would say, and maybe you guys, I mean, obviously you guys can speak to this more than I can now, but it seems easier to read a story versus a dense treatise, right? So it's easier, I think, to get into, a story where there's just characters talking back and forth. But the flip side, the downside is, or at least I always maintain, is we don't really know who to attribute these views to. I mean, in some sense, we have the character Socrates expressing views in these dialogues, especially. So I wrote up here, I should probably explain what I was jotting down here. The early, middle, and late periods, okay, of these dialogues. So the scholars break down these dialogues in the early, the middle, and the later periods. Early, so there's probably more nuances to this division, but in my mind, I've always thought about the early dialogues. So the first dialogues that Plato wrote, Socrates is this dominant figure. He just, the Republic is one of the early dialogues. Socrates is dominating everything. He's the main figure, the main character throughout these dialogues. The middle dialogues I kind of view as a transition period. You still see a lot of Socrates, but you see a little bit less of him. And then the later dialogues is where some of the scholars would say you start to see Plato finally kind of standing on his own and not necessarily just repeating what Socrates says, but forming some of his own theories and so on. So you get, if you're familiar with the theory of the forms, so that sort of this obscure metaphysical doctrine that's offered by Plato, that comes most generally in the later period. But the whole thing, though, the whole point here is, so Socrates as a figure, even in the later period, in the later dialogues, he still shows up. And so, Socrates as a primary figure throughout, and he's expressing all these views, which a lot of us take to be Plato, but how do we really know, Plato's views, but how do we really know? And so that's one of the issues with the dialogue form is, what does the author actually think? We don't know. And so who do we attribute these views to? So what the character Socrates says, is that indicative of what the historical Socrates really said, or what Plato thinks Socrates would have said? Or is that just indicative of what Plato himself thinks? Or none of the above? So there's that ambiguity in play, right? So you'll oftentimes see me saying, Socrates slash Plato, because, and what I mean when I say that, and why I say that, is because we don't know who to attribute these views to, these beliefs that are being expressed here. So that's, I would say, if there's a downside to the dialogue form, in my opinion, that would be it. So again, very prolific writer, a lot of dialogues, both pluses and minuses, you might say, in terms of the dialogue form. Okay? So Socrates was Plato's teacher, and I'm, by the way, referencing slides 2 and 3 here as we talk about some of the intro, stuff in terms of Socrates and Plato here. So Socrates was Plato's teacher, so we talked about that. We've been talking about that all throughout the course, right? I mentioned that in the very first video, I believe, very first lecture. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, that's the same lineage here. So Socrates taught Plato, who taught Aristotle. And we've already discussed Aristotle before. I believe that was lecture 13. So we're sort of familiar with Aristotle. Anyway, so what's interesting is, so not only is there this ambiguity involved in terms of who to attribute the views expressed in these dialogues to, but then there's this ambiguity involved in terms of Socrates himself. So very interesting character here. But who is Socrates? In some sense, there's some question there, right? And there's this issue, because Socrates himself never really wrote anything. Rather, he goes around and just mingles with the citizens of Athens and discusses philosophy, but he doesn't ever write anything like Plato and Aristotle. So what did the real Socrates think? Now, we do know there was this dude named Socrates, because you have some other authors referencing him as well. But by and large, right, so we know this dude existed, but by and large, 95% of what we think we know about Socrates, we glean by way of Plato's dialogues. So there's this open question: to what extent does the real Socrates, the real historical Socrates, actually match up with, I should say, Plato's version of him that we get, right? Our impression of Socrates that we get thanks to Socrates or to Plato. So will the real Socrates please stand up? Right? I mean, who is the real Socrates? There's some question as to that, I would say. Okay, so that's slide 2. Slide 3, on slide 3, I kind of just elaborate on Socrates' unique characters. So if you had sort of this vision of what a philosopher looked like coming into the course, it probably maps up pretty well with Socrates. So this was a guy that admittedly had no interest in practical affairs. He was again, the traditional philosopher, right, who was just immersed in these deep questions and can't help himself but, be interested in these kinds of things. And of course, he thinks it's the just thing to do too, right? That we ought to be engaged in these kind of philosophical quests, this drive for knowledge. And he talks as if he'll never stop. In fact, as we'll see in the second part, he said even when he's on trial by his fellow Athenians and ultimately sentenced to death, he says, he believes so strongly in his ways that he won't change his ways, even regardless of what they decide, because that's how sure he was of what he was doing, right? That this pursuit of knowledge, right, was the proper thing to do. And so, yeah, if you had this idea of a philosopher coming into class, it was probably, Socrates probably maps up pretty well with that, right? He, again, had no mind for practical affairs. If it wasn't for friends and family, he would have been homeless out on the streets, because he couldn't help himself but, pursue these deep sorts of issues. It literally took up his entire day, and so he was, there's not many people that are like that. and he was certainly unique, and he was a cult-like figure. He drew like a cult-like following, I should say. I mean, people were, he was alluring. People were drawn to him, and they were fascinated by him. He was a unique figure, and he started to be very polarizing. People either grew to love him, and actually many of them began to emulate his ways, or oftentimes, if they were the subject of his inquiries and made to look like fools, they grew to despise him. And so that ultimately led to his downfall because, actually one of the things that drew a lot of people to him was that he wasn't afraid to approach whoever it was the same way, right? He would, and a lot of us aspire to be that way, right? No matter who it is we're talking to, we treat them exactly the same way. But how many of you would treat a celebrity, right, your idol, if you were to meet them on the street the exact same way you'd treat someone else? Not many of us, right? Well, Socrates wasn't afraid to but whoever professed knowledge, again, in this deep-seated philosophical sort of way, whoever professed that kind of knowledge, he wasn't afraid of who they were, whether they were in positions of power. He would go and apply the Socratic method. You might have heard of the idea of the Socratic method, basically just a Q&A back and forth. You propose to know what's wise and just and so on. Well, blah, 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 right? He would apply the Socratic method, and slowly but surely, typically what ends up happening, you see this happen in a lot of the dialogues, is his interlocutor is made to look like a fool, right? They'll either realize that they're ignorant, or they'll say, "Oh, I gotta go," right, and be all flustered and maybe not realize how ignorant they were, but everyone else realizes that, right? And so these people don't appreciate that. And a lot of these, again, some of these people are in positions of great power because Socrates isn't afraid to address whoever it is. If provided they have some pretense of knowledge, of wisdom, they suggest they know what's going to happen after we die or what the gods think or something like that. Well, Socrates is going to go talk to them. And then oftentimes, like I said, that wouldn't end up working out well for Socrates because, again, these people were in positions of power and ultimately grew to despise him and ended up putting him on trial and getting him, sentenced to death. And what's more, so a lot of people though were drawn to that, and so while some people hated him, at the same time, a lot of people admired that quality about him. It is very unique, and so fortunately, because of that following he had, he was also taken care of. He even, we'll flesh this out again in the second part, but even when he's sentenced to death, his friends and family cared about him so much. He had friends that were that devoted to him that they paid off the guards, and they had an escape, planned and paid for. It would have gone off without a hitch. But again, Socrates is so devoted to justice that he thinks that's the wrong thing to do. But again, it's his following and the people that appreciated him. That's how far they were willing to go for him. So he had people that loved him, and he had people that hated him. And again, he is kind of that archetype, if you will, of a philosopher. He's always the guy I hold up as, if you have a vision of a philosopher coming into course, it's Socrates typically matches up pretty well with that. Okay, so that's our introduction to Socrates and Plato. Again, pretty interesting figures, obviously very important historically throughout the history of philosophy, influential on Aristotle, if nothing else. And then obviously these guys, though, are their threads of influence run throughout arguably all veins of philosophy. And who was it? Alfred North Whitehead, I believe, once said that all philosophy is but a footnote to Plato or something like that. I probably butchered that, but basically suggesting that all original philosophy, Plato did, and then everything else is sort of a reaction to, Plato's original work. Everything subsequently throughout the history of philosophy is just a reaction, a reworking of what Plato already did. So that speaks to the significance of Plato, Socrates, and so on, the import of these guys. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn then to slide 4, where I will set the stage, in terms of what happens in our particular excerpt, which again comes from book 2 or chapter 2. So we want to talk real quick about what happens in book 1 or chapter 1 of the Republic. And so what's really fascinating about Plato's dialogues And the more you read them, the more you appreciate this. Is they're very psychological. You have different characters, and they have their own tendencies. And Thrasymachus is one of those characters. By the way, I meant to mention this earlier. This book, if you were to read no other book in philosophy, I'm not saying it's my favorite book. I mean, there's an argument to be made for that. But this is just speaking to how important and significant I think this book is. If you were to read no other book in philosophy, I think you should read The Republic by Plato. It's one of those books where every subsequent time you read it, you take something very significant away from it that you didn't before, and you're like, how did I not catch that? You know, and then it happens multiple times each time you reread it. It's kind of akin to sometimes when you listen to a good album, one of your favorite albums, and somehow you miss something and you hear something a certain way, you know, the thousandth time you heard it. And it's like, you know, and movies, some movies are similar where you take something significant, you know, away from it the second and third time that you didn't take away from it the first one or two times you watched it. So The Republic, very rewarding book. Actually, this might be one of the first books I purchased I mean, I had a ton of books in philosophy going back into high school, but the first one I think I purchased for a course because I had to get this for Intro to Philosophy. And it was one of 6 books we actually read in their entirety for the course. And so I always laugh when I have students now complaining about the reading that I require. It's nothing in comparison to what I had to do back in the day when I had to climb uphill to get to school and so on. No, but seriously, reading this and then 5 other books. But again, very rewarding book. I have a lot of history with it. I've literally read this book probably at least 3 or 4 times in its entirety. I mean, notes throughout. You know, every time again, I'm constantly taking notes. There's a lot of history with this book. It's fallen in bathtubs. I've dried it out, and that's how important it has been to me. My wife and I once for Halloween switched roles, um, tried to dress up as each other, and so she carried around this book because she was me. So anyway, very important, very important book in the history of philosophy. Can't say that enough. So, but anyway, what stands out in my mind about Plato and especially in the Republic is the psychological nature of the book. And you see, and this is one of the themes in a lot of the dialogue, Socrates sort of playing to whoever he's speaking to, right? He might not be speaking the literal truth. He might have to tweak it a little bit. You get this idea of a noble lie in the Republic, amongst many other things, right? You might have to tweak it a little bit to actually resonate with the person you're talking to, right? You might not be able to speak in literal truth because you might not be able to connect to the person. Rather, you might have to adjust your method and your ways so as to make some sort of progress with them. And so you see Socrates doing this with each of the different characters in the Republic, and oftentimes throughout many of these dialogues. Thrasymachus is one of the characters, especially in the first book. He's kind of a hothead. He gets angry very often. He's throughout much of the first book of chapter 1. He's just stewing. You might just envision him kind of stewing in the corner, and you know what they're doing in the first book is kind of offering their definitions of justice. What does it mean to do the right thing? What is justice? And so you get all these definitions offered by these different characters. And of course, one of the things Socrates is pretty well known for is being critical, right? Saying what's wrong with all, what all these different thinkers suggest. And that's no different here in this discussion. So somebody will offer a definition of justice. Socrates suggests what's wrong with it. And so Thrasymachus, anyway, is getting extremely upset about this. And he finally interrupts. Socrates, why don't you offer what your definition is? Why don't you tell us what justice is for once? Stop asking us and do something yourself. Of course, within 2 pages, Socrates has weaseled his way out and is getting Thrasymachus to offer his own definition of justice, which is classic Socrates. But anyway, so the whole point here, though, is Thrasymachus, very interesting character, explodes and issues this kind of famous challenge at the end of book 1 or chapter 1, okay, known as Thrasymachus' challenge. He issues this. So he explains what he thinks justice is. It's really just the advantage of the strong and whoever's in power. And it's basically this fanciful idea that they float about to get peons, those beneath them, to act in ways that are profitable to those that are in power, to them that are in power. So he offers this definition. And then at the end of the Republic, book 1 of the Republic, you get Thrasymachus offering his famous challenge. So Thrasymachus' challenge. Socrates. So in this demarcates a shift then in the focus of the entire dialogue from what it was in book 1 to then what it will be in some sense for the rest of the remainder of the dialogue. And they were talking about what justice is, but with this challenge, Thrasymachus is going to then shift the focus to in what sense is justice useful for us? So never mind what it is or what it amounts to and what doing the right thing looks like, in what way is it good for us? So what is this challenge? It's basically, it's Socrates, you oftentimes suggest that, the person who's just, the moral person, right, that they live the good life. That's the best, most optimal life for us. I don't think so, right? The challenge is then to prove that the just person lives the better life, because I don't think that's the case. So that's what I'm getting at here. That's on slide 4 again. So Thrasymachus' challenge. Prove, Socrates, that the just person, the moral person, in fact, lives the more desirable life. Because I, and most people, Thrasymachus argues, right, think that that's not the case. That in fact, the unjust person, all things considered, will live the better life, the more desirable life. Okay. So, like I mentioned, so Socrates offers a quick, response. Well, look, the just are cooperative. That's going to be to their advantage. The unjust are uncooperative by nature. Can you ever trust a criminal, a partner in crime, that kind of idea? There's always going to be this lack of cooperation amongst the unjust, and so that, on the face of it, seems to be an advantage. Socrates wants to say to those who were just, but really, then the rest of the entire dialogue is, in some sense, then. Of course, there's so much to it, but in some sense, it's a big, elaborate defense on Socrates' part. Well, it's a debate back and forth, in both camps, but it's an entire debate around this very issue, and then ultimately, Socrates offering his defense of his position that no, doing the right thing, justice, that's desirable in itself, right, and that will actually lead to the better life, despite, as we hinted at earlier, what most people's behavior might suggest, right? And despite the fact that many people, if not most, would engage in immoral behavior when given the opportunity without consequence, that's actually not the best thing for them, right? And so Socrates, again, that position, that the defense of that position is basically what the rest of the Republic amounts to. Okay? So that's what they're up to. That's what they're up to here. Of course, I left my eraser way over here. So let's go ahead then, and turning to slide 5, get into this debate then, right? In what sense is doing the right thing desirable or useful for us? So here we're going to revisit, remember when we were making that point about the goodwill in lecture 11, I think that's part 1 video, and we went through and made that point in a lot of different ways regarding Kant's point about the goodwill and how only that is good without qualification. And we said it with respect to Plato's 3 types of goods. And I said, oh, hey, we'll be revisiting that exact section of the Republic where they bring that up. We'll be revisiting that. Well, here we are revisiting that. And I meant to say it earlier as well, Thrasymachus then, he goes off after issuing this challenge and kind of pouts again. And you don't hear back from him, I want to say. It's been a while since I've actually read through the entire dialogue. But I want to say it's another 3 or 4 chapters or books before then you hear from Thrasymachus again. And so instead, you get Glaucon and some other characters then picking up Thrasymachus's position for him, and then advancing sort of Thrasymachus's position for him, pushing against Socrates on behalf of Thrasymachus. And I like the way, again, Glaucon, another interesting character. He's kind of in a tug of war, right? The way he presents it, he says, Socrates, look, for the sake of argument, I'm going to present Thrasymachus' position as best I can, so that I can really then tease out from you the best defense of justice possible, right? So that we can then tease out from you the best defense of your position, that justice is not only good for its consequences, but also in and of itself for the person. And so Glaucon, he makes it very clear, I don't necessarily agree with what I'm saying in defense of Thrasymachus' position, but for the sake of, again, soliciting the best defense of your position, which I'm really drawn to, I'm going to argue as vehemently against your position as possible. So That's really what's going on then here in our particular excerpt. And so we get the very beginning a return then for us anyway to that discussion of the three types of goods. So we'll briefly just put it back up here. So we have things that are good merely for their consequences. We have things that are good merely in themselves. In the moment, you might think, okay? And then, of course, we have the most noble, and that's for both. Let's see, how do I want to put this? Let's just put it. So things that are good both in themselves and for consequences. Okay, so these guys are bringing it up, right? Glaucon brings it up. He says, Socrates, would you agree that everything we consider desirable, good, okay, falls into one of three categories? Now, we might have a debate about where a particular good or desirable thing falls, and that's, of course, what they're going to do with respect to justice, right? But all good things or all desirable things fall into one of these three categories. Okay? We have things that are good merely for their consequences. So, and these, so you almost get the sense of, these aren't even really good in them. In what sense are they even really truly good these things themselves? Because they're only good insofar as they're getting us something else. So, for example, most of us would put money here, right? We don't really want money per se. It's what the money gets us, right? The 17-car garage, paying the bills, etc. So some of us might put our job along the same lines there. And now some of us might put a job here, our job here, right? The more typical example here, and the one they bring up, is health. Okay. So there, before I get there, so hopefully that idea of things that are good, not in themselves, but only insofar as they get us something else. Okay? And so money is a classic example of that. And then we have things that, before I get to that one, things that are good merely in the moment or merely in themselves. So like somebody, my example is always like someone tells a joke in the moment. It's great to have a laugh in the moment, but that's not going to get you anything down the road, right? So joy in the moment, let's put that here. And then we have things that are good both in themselves in the moment, and then they're thought to be good for what they get us down the road. Things like health is the classic example. You might say knowledge, your job. Some people might enjoy that in itself, and then also enjoy paying the bills. Okay? So why are we talking about this? Well, Glaucon wants to know, Socrates, to which class or category or group would you ascribe justice or doing the right thing? Okay? And Glaucon presents this to Socrates on page 108 of our text. Now, Glaucon, and then Thrasymachus and Pals, all these guys, right? They're going to present what they're suggesting is the normal or ordinary, average, everyday view. In other words, they're presenting this as if this is what most people think, and that's going to be that justice belongs here, and not here, but here. That justice is only good insofar as we appear just, and hence can then solicit the good consequences associated with justice. If we lack that appearance of justice, being as just as we may, right? It doesn't matter if we lack that appearance of justice, Glaucon wants to argue, then we're not going to have all the good consequences, right? Getting a good job, staying out of jail, and so on. And therefore, there's going to be nothing good or desirable about doing the right thing anymore, is going to be the argument of Glaucon. Right? So Glaucon and those guys are going to put it here, whereas Socrates wants to say, no, come on, it's going to be here. And right, Glaucon's going to make some appeals then, as we'll see, to some arguments for his position. Okay? Appeals to, for example, the Ring of Gyges, the famous legend of the Ring of Gyges. But so hopefully you're clear, what this debate is about, and really then what the entire book, in some sense, is about. Okay? It's going to be Socrates suggesting, look, despite what the overt actions of human beings might suggest, okay, it truly is best for us to be, just, to do the right thing, regardless of consequences. It's actually the best thing for us. And so, again, we'll see mostly his defense of that position developed in the second part. Okay? But here in the first part, turning to slide 6, we're going to focus then on Glaucon's defense of this position, right? Hey, justice or doing the right thing, it's merely good in terms of what it gets us for its consequences. It's not good in and of itself. Okay? So I guess I should say like slide 6. So basically that's me presenting it what we just said, right? So Socrates thinks it belongs here. Okay. So all this leads Glaucon to say, quote, setting aside the rewards and what they get us. So that leads him to want to sort of focus on what they are in themselves, doing the right thing versus not doing the right thing. Okay? Setting aside, this is a quote, setting aside the rewards and results, I want to know what they are in themselves and how they inwardly work in the soul, end quote. So that's from 109. So again, on behalf of the many, he's going to present the common view, okay, what he suggests the common view. He'll explain, among other things, the origin and true nature of justice or doing the right thing, how it is that people began doing the right thing or how it was that justice emerged. And then he's going to argue basically that people who engage in justice, who do the right thing, they do so unwillingly because it's necessary, not because they want to actually do it. And so what are we getting here? Turning to slide 7. Basically, let's say at the top of that slide, we're basically getting a Hobbesian picture of morality. What we really want, according to Glaucon and pals, is to do all kinds of unjust stuff. They're egoists. They think that we all, want to feed our own selfish desires constantly. And that's what we really, really want. And that when we act justly and hence don't constantly cater to those selfish desires, it's only because we kind of have to, right? Because if we were left unfettered and allowed ourselves to constantly cater to all those selfish desires, we would somehow suffer because everyone else is doing the same thing. Again, it's a very Hobbesian sort of picture. So that's what I suggest on the top of page 7. So this is Glaucon, again, very reminiscent of Hobbes. He says, quote, to do injustice is by nature good, to suffer injustice evil, but the evil is greater than the good. So he says this on 109. So what are we getting at here? Look, ideally, here's the ideal scenario. I do unjust stuff, and no one else does. That would be awesome. Let's put, okay, does unjust stuff. Okay, so that would be awesome. But the problem is, okay, so if we were to sort of, there's 4 possibilities, right? We could then say nobody does unjust stuff. That's going to be a possibility. Everybody does unjust stuff. Or I don't do unjust stuff. I don't know what kind of sadistic scenario this would be, but everyone else does. Okay, look. Obviously, we don't want that. Here's the ideal, right? I do unjust stuff. I get away with whatever I want. I hoard the bananas, the cans of Guinness, going back to Hobbes' lecture, right, the Hobbes videos. I get all that stuff, right, and no one else does it. The problem is, this is not practical. That's what I'm getting out of the second bullet point on slide 7, okay? Since no one cannot be allowed, or since no one can expect to be allowed to do injustice without risking it to himself, right, that's not a possibility. We can't, in what scenario would this be a possibility? It's not, right? It's not practical, okay? Since we can't have that, he's basically going to suggest we could settle for the lesser of the evils. So that's the sense in which it's the lesser of the evils, right? This is what we want. All these others are evils or less desirable, right? We're going to settle for something else as far as we have to pick one of these because this isn't practical, okay? So now we're left with, and obviously no one's going to pick this. So here are the same scenarios that we were presented with Hobbes, right? This is the state of nature or state of anarchy. Basically, these are the only, okay, setting that ridiculous scenario aside, right? These are the only two practical or realistic options, right? A state of nature, a state of anarchy where anybody, including myself, can do unjust stuff. Or some sort of contract, you might say, in which Glaucon does say, and obviously Hobbes talks about, where we come together then and agree, I won't do all the things I actually really want to do, if you agree then to not do all the things you actually really want to do, all that unjust stuff. Okay? So this is the sense in which we do it because it's necessary, but not because we really want to do it. This is what we really want. Okay, this is what these guys are saying. This is what we really want, but we kind of settle for this, okay? Which is exactly right, kind of what Hobbes says. Obviously, this is an option. These are our two only options. This sucks, Hobbes says. We have to get out of the state of nature, form a contract, and that's basically what Glaucon and pals are going to suggest. Right? That's the only viable option, because to suffer injustice sucks more than doing injustice feels good, right? It hurts more to suffer from injustice than it feels good to do injustice, and so we then opt for this, is what Glaucon and pals say. So choosing the lesser of the evils, groups of individuals, quote, agree among themselves to have neither the infliction of or suffering of injustice. Okay. Hence there arise, listen to this could have come right out of Hobbes. Hence there arise laws and mutual covenants, and that which is ordained by law is termed by them lawful and just. End quote. That's 109. Justice is thus, quote, a meaner compromise between the best of all, which is to do injustice and not be punished, and the worst of all, which is to suffer injustice without the power of retaliation. So that was 110, okay, from page 110 of the text. Okay. I think that's pretty straightforward. Now, whether you agree with that or Socrates isn't necessarily going to agree with that analysis. They'll agree that that's what most people might think. That doesn't mean they're right. Okay. So, to support his position and the position of the many, or the common view, as Glaucon calls it, he's going to then appeal to a couple different tools, I guess, for lack of a better term here. Couple of tools then to make his case. So the first one we have is the famous Ring of Gyges. So having read the excerpt, hopefully you can then see why he's bringing this up, why he thinks that the legend of the Ring of Gyges helps support his position. And again, he wants to say justice itself, right? How do I want to put this? So let's say really, sorry about this, guys. So we have this idea of really being just, and then appearing just. And so one of the big themes here is going to be, this is all we really care about, Glaucon and pals want to say. This is the only way in which doing the right thing or justice is desirable, because remove this, it doesn't matter whether you're really just or not. Remove this, right? Because this is what yields the good consequences. So if you appear just, no matter what you really are, then you'll stay out of jail, you'll get a good job, so on and so forth. And he wants to say, but remove that appearance, and you also remove the good consequences, and what's left? Well, he wants to say, if you then all appear the opposite, it's going to be a bunch of bad stuff, right? And so this side, what you really are, doesn't actually matter, right? It's just this, and whether you can give off the appearance of doing the right thing. That's what really matters, not doing the right thing in and of itself, right? Whether or not you truly are just and really do the right thing, that doesn't matter. You just got to convince everyone else that you do. Okay? And that's what really matters. That's what's really desirable. So remove the allure of all the good stuff associated with appearing just, okay, and then there's no longer any incentive to then continue doing the right thing, so to speak. Okay, and it works the opposite way too. Then, right? If we think about it in terms of appearing unjust, right? Why do so many people not want to do things that lead them to appear unjust? Because they have bad consequences. We get thrown in jail and so on, right? But if you could remove the threat of appearing unjust, okay, and you could be really unjust without the threat of appearing unjust and then suffering all those bad consequences, well, he's going to say then everyone's going to start doing that unjust stuff, right? Because the only reason why they're not doing unjust stuff is because they want to stay out of prison and they want to have the good job and so on. But if you remove, again, all appearances, the threat of appearing unjust, right, you remove that, and then boom, what ends up happening? People start showing their true colors, so to speak. And that's why he's offering the Ring of Gyges, why he's appealing to the Ring of Gyges. So what happens in the Ring of Gyges? Right, the shepherd walks upon the earth. There's this earthquake, right, and finds this ring in the crack in the earth, puts it on. He's in a meeting, realizes when he turns it in a certain way, he turns invisible. The others don't realize he's there. He does, messes around with it, realizes he turns it a certain way, becomes invisible, turns it back, becomes visible again. So what immediately ends up happening? And by the way, can you tell that there's been influences in literature and our culture, from the Republic, right? Do we have any other instances of rings making us invisible? Anyway, so why is Glaucon appealing to this? Hopefully, it's pretty clear because what happens? So this way we're framing it here as appearing unjust. Okay, we have bad consequences. So that's why, insofar as we're not, insofar as we're being just, right, and doing what's right, it's only because we fear this. Okay, so what happens when you remove this? Then everybody's going to do this, right? Everyone's going to become unjust and show their true colors because they lack that threat, right? What they really fear is not injustice itself, but appearing unjust, because again, they fear the consequences associated with that. So, if Socrates was right, Glaucon would argue, right? What would we expect Gyges to do if doing the right thing, if justice, we're not just good for its consequences, but we're good in and of itself, we're desirable in itself. We wouldn't expect Gyges' behavior to change, the shepherd's behavior to change, because again, it was thought to be good in and of itself. But lo and behold, right, Glaucon's whole point is there's nothing desirable in and of itself because I can remove the consequences, right, the appearances from the equation, and boom, his behavior immediately changes. There was nothing intrinsically desirable about doing the right thing. Otherwise, his behavior wouldn't have changed, or at least not as drastically as it in fact ended up doing, or as it ended up changing. And so Glaucon wants to say, what do you have to say to that, Socrates? If you were right, if there really was something intrinsically desirable or good about doing the right thing, about justice, then we wouldn't expect people's behavior to change, at least not so drastically. What does Gyges immediately do? He seduces the queen, kills the king, takes over the kingdom, right? All these things that are associated with, injustice. He immediately engages in these acts when the threat of appearing unjust is removed by way of the ring. And I thought it was interesting and funny how they even talk as though, if people's behavior didn't change when given this capacity or this ability to act without fear of negative consequences, they'd be deemed idiots, right? People would think there's something wrong with them, right? Or they're at least very strange and seemingly unhuman. And we'll say a little bit more about that when we talk about Socrates' own character, because he seems to stick to the path of justice at times, even when he could stray without consequences, which is what they're suggesting seems to be idiotic to most people, right? People who still do the right thing, even when it's, without good consequence, or refraining from doing the wrong thing, even when you could without bad consequences. Again, that's thought to be idiotic by most people when you have the ability to do bad stuff without fear of consequence and you don't. Okay? Again, these guys seem to share that Hobbesian egoistic view of our fundamental human nature, that we are ultimately very selfish and driven to pursue our own interests at all times. Okay, so that was the Ring of Gyges. Hopefully that's kind of clear what he's up to with that. Now, tool number 2, so keep these distinct, okay, is we have that thought experiment, okay? So where he is comparing the perfectly just with the perfectly unjust. Okay, so here, this dude or dudette is unjust, but appears just. And this dude or dudette is just, but appears the opposite. Now, why do we need to compare these in such a fashion? Well, again, he wants to analyze what these are, right? Doing the right thing or not doing the right thing, justice or injustice, in and of themselves, divorced of good or bad consequences associated with them, right? So then to analyze the merits of justice in itself, right, we can't, right, we want to highlight the perfectly just individual, the person who's really, truly just, despite actually appearing the opposite. And we want him to appear the opposite so we can truly measure the merit of acting just in and of itself, right? Because if we associated any good consequences with him, right, that are associated with appearing just, then how do we know what truly incentivized him, right? So we have to, in other words, if we want to analyze the merits of justice in itself, we have to analyze it devoid of any good consequences associated with appearing just. So let's instead make him appear unjust, the opposite, and then we'll really be able to test in the merits of justice in itself. So let's see how good justice is truly in itself by, again, cutting off any possible good side effects associated with also appearing just. Then we'll be best able to analyze the merits of, again, that justice in itself. And so here, right, we want to analyze, it's kind of the opposite. The person that's really unjust, but then has the appearance of the opposite, right, that they do the right thing all the time and so on, okay? And so, again, we'll be able to truly test the merits of injustice itself, okay? And so he wants to say, well, look, isn't it pretty obvious, what ends up happening? Ultimately, all right, this person leads a far happier life. They are happy. He wants to say, if you compare these, so what are we doing in the thought experiment? Compare the lives of these two people, he's saying. Okay, and the one is extremely happy. The other is extremely miserable. Okay, no one, the idea then is, if we think about it this way, no one's going to take this route. Rather, everyone is going to take this route, which seems to suggest then, in terms of how they are in themselves, that injustice, right, is the more profitable, desirable route, that it's more appealing in itself. Okay, because again, cut off the good consequences associated with also appearing just, and there doesn't seem to be anything left, right, that's appealing about being just anymore. Excuse me. So he says, this is Adimantus, this is elsewhere in the Republic. He says, quote, there is no advantage in my being just if I don't also seem to be, while the labors and penalties involved are evident. Okay, so it's painful oftentimes, and there's negative consequences associated with actually being just. And so it's far worse than if you have to do that, especially when you're not then reaping the good consequences associated with also appearing just. while the labors and penalties involved are evident. But if I'm unjust, but have provided myself with a reputation for justice, a divine life is promised. So what is the recipe for, maximum happiness? Be unjust as you really want to be, right? But then work on appearing the opposite, appearing as just as possible, but then getting away with as much injustice as you can. And remember Hobbes, whole point about needing a coercive sovereign to ensure that people comply with the contract. Well, this is exactly why, right? Because he agrees that this is how most people think, okay? And then we're going to try to get away with stuff if we can. So that was why Hobbes was emphasizing that need for the all-powerful sovereign. And so I do want to conclude by, again, I mentioned this a moment ago, but talking about how it does seem like Socrates, this will be a nice segue then to our part 2 video, because we'll talk a lot about Socrates' general character, or at least more about it. It does seem like he lives the life of the perfectly just. So this is from 111. I believe this is Glaucon. He says, this is the top of slide 10, but it comes from 111 of our text. Quote, let him be the best of men, and let him be thought the worst, right? So again, that perfectly just individual. Then he will have been put to the proof, and we shall see whether he will be affected by the fear of infamy and its consequences, and let him continue thus to the hour of death. And the idea was, no one's going to continue thus to the hour of death, because that's a miserable life. Everybody's going to prefer this route. Well, as I point out, and as I've just been alluding to, it does seem like Socrates picks this route. Okay. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but there, he has this opportunity, and we'll flesh this out in more detail in the second part. This opportunity to escape after he's been sentenced to death, and this escape it'll work, right? And he knows this, but yet he feels like it would be the wrong thing to do, and so even though, right, he could have done the wrong thing and solicited a longer life, because he feels it's the wrong thing to do, he sticks with what the state decided and drinks the hemlock famously and is killed. And so to the hour of his death, so to speak, right, he continues on this path where he seems to still do the right thing, even though, right, he's put to death because he appears to be unjust to at least a faction of the Athenians that matters. So Socrates could have done what he considered to be an injustice and carried out an escape from prison that was orchestrated by, again, some of those that were drawn to him. The success of which was guaranteed, right? The success of that escape, so as to avoid, future suffering, specifically death. But he chose to instead stick to the path of what he thought was the just thing to do, right? Stick to the path of justice. Interestingly, Adimantus, again, another character in the dialogue, refers to someone who, quote, cannot stand doing injustice, or who has gained knowledge and keeps away from injustice, as having a divine nature. There's something, so the suggestion is whoever still sticks to this path, so for example, Socrates, there's something divine, or at least not normal about such a character. They seem not like your typical human, right? Most people would go this way. And I think for what it's worth, Socrates would agree. He's not debating that most people would act this way or that most people would think a certain way. Okay, his whole stance, again, as we'll see in the second part, is going to be that they're ignorant in acting that way or in thinking that way. Okay, just because most people think or do a certain, think a certain way or do a certain thing, doesn't mean that they're correct, right? And that's going to be his position. But it's interesting to me that, again, this is considered divine or not, not human. It's atypical, I guess would be one way to put it. And Socrates seems to kind of be on board with that idea. He points out in the Apology, another dialogue by Plato that kind of chronicles the trial of Socrates. Another dialogue by Plato. Socrates points out in that dialogue that in constantly neglecting his own interests for the sake of others and constantly catering to the masses and ensuring their welfare, that he manifests a sort of divine nature, and constantly, and in doing that, he thinks he's doing the right thing, right, and catering to the path of justice, and he equates that with having a kind of divine nature, something that's not typical. So I think that's interesting. Anyway, that is then where I want to conclude the first part of the video. We'll wrap up here. I'll leave you with the intermission questions. What kind of good do you think justice is? Are you on board with Socrates at this point, or on board with Glaucon and pals? Of course, we haven't really seen Socrates' robust defense of his position yet. We've seen Glaucon in his case, but what about Socrates in his case? But at this point, what would you say? What kind of good or desirable thing is justice or doing the right thing? In what sense is it desirable? And then what would you do if you possessed the Ring of Gyges? Would your behavior change much? This is always a fun question in face-to-face classes for the discussion. Would your behavior change much? Would you, in significant ways? I always have the Robin Hood figures who say, yeah, I'd be doing lots of different stuff, but it'd always be for noble purposes. Rob the bank and then give the money to those who are truly in need and so on. It would be interesting to trip a professor out in the hall or something like that, right? If you're invisible, or maybe tweak a grade or two. You wouldn't do that in the grade book, right? If you're invisible, no, you wouldn't do that. What would you do if you had the power of invisibility? Presumably Socrates isn't changing his behavior, right? Because doing the right thing is good in itself, as we'll see in the second part of the video. Presumably, if given such a ring, his behavior isn't changing much, if at all. Whereas the insinuation on Glaucon's part is that most of us, for being honest, our behavior is going to change significantly, a la, the shepherd in the Ring of Gyges. Okay, so looking forward to the second part, then we will talk a little bit more about Socrates and his, Socrates / Plato and their general view of evil, and the idea that when we engage in injustice, so when all of us start doing this, that any time you have an instance of injustice or something that's wrong, that's wrong, it's a reflection of ignorance and in some sense a lack of true intention on the part of the person. And as we'll see, it's interesting because Socrates makes this case by appealing to self-interest. He's going to argue, right? He's going to appeal to Glaucon's own appeal to our egoism, right? He's going to say, well, actually, doing evil is never in the person's own interest. And so far as we're doing the evil, then we must be doing it ignorantly, right? We don't really intend to do it because we would never do anything that's against our own interest if we knew better, right? So insofar as we still do the evil, we must be doing it ignorantly and not really intend to do it. And so we'll talk about his two main arguments, or what I would say are his two main arguments for that position, what I call the external and internal arguments. Some interesting sort of cases that he makes. And so we'll see then how that ultimately offers a defense of his position of why doing the right thing, justice, okay, morality, no matter what happens, that's always desirable, not only for its consequences, which are oftentimes good, but it's always also desirable in and of itself. And we'll see again why Socrates suggests that in the second part video. So until then, I hope you enjoyed this first one, and we'll see you for that one.